September 30, 1955. A silver Porsche was cutting through the California desert at high speed. Behind the wheel sat one of the most famous young men in the entire world, James Dean. He was 24 years old, he was fearless, and he had absolutely no idea that he had less than 2 hours left to live. The car he was driving had a name painted on its rear, Little Bastard. And that car, it would go on to become the most disturbing automobile in Hollywood history. Not because of the crash, but because of everything that happened after. To understand what happened to that Porsche, we first need to understand who James Dean was. By 1955, he had appeared in only 2 major films, East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and yet somehow the entire world already knew his face. But off the screen, Dean had an obsession that most people talk about: speed. He raced cars. Seriously. Competitively. He lived for it. And on September 21st, 1955, he found the car he had been looking for. A 1955 Porsche 550 Spyder. Light. Aerodynamic. Built for one thing: going fast. He bought it the same day he saw it. He named it immediately, Little Bastard, painted right there on the rear of the car in bold lettering. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. A few days before the crash, someone looked at that car and said something to Dean that nobody forgot. It was Alec Guinness, the legendary British actor. Just 1 week before the crash, at around 10 p.m., Guinness met James Dean outside an Italian Hollywood restaurant called Villa Capri, a well-known celebrity hotspot in the 1950s, located on North Macadam Place in Hollywood. Dean proudly showed off his new Porsche 550 Spyder. Guinness took one look and felt a chill. He warned Dean, "Please never get into that car. If you do, you will be dead within a week." Now this isn't just a rumor whispered among Hollywood gossips. Alec Guinness told this story himself. On BBC television, in a 1977 interview with Michael Parkinson, and again in his own autobiography. Guinness later claimed he felt a spooky compulsion to warn Dean, and remembered the car looking strangely sinister. And Dean, he laughed it off. He was just 24 years old, one of the most exciting young actors in the world, and he had a Porsche. What could possibly go wrong? September 30th, 1955, a Friday morning in Los Angeles. Before setting off, Dean stopped at Competition Motors on Vine Street, the same garage where he had bought the Little Bastard just 9 days earlier, now preparing it for its first race. His father and uncle were there. The group had coffee and donuts together at the Hollywood Ranch Market across the street, said their goodbyes. Nobody knew it was the last time. They left at around 1:15 in the afternoon. Originally, the plan was to trailer the Little Bastard behind Dean's new Ford Country Squire station wagon, but Wutherich had convinced him to drive it instead, to break the engine in properly before race day. So Dean climbed into the Porsche, Wutherich took the passenger seat, and they set off. Behind them in the station wagon, towing the empty trailer, was Bill Hickman, a professional stunt driver, a Warner Brothers veteran, and one of Dean's closest friends. It was Hickman who had given Dean the nickname Little Bastard in the first place. He called Dean Little Bastard, Dean called him Big Bastard, and Dean had put that name on the car. Hickman had also been quietly mentoring Dean's racing, teaching him techniques like four-wheel drifting. Riding alongside Hickman was photographer Sanford Roth, who was working on a photo story about Dean at the races for Collier's magazine. The racing number was 130. Painted on the hood. At 3:30 p.m., near Mettler Station south of Bakersfield, CHP officer Odie Hunter pulled them over. Dean was doing 65 in a 55 zone. Hickman, following in the station wagon with the empty trailer, was ticketed separately. Towing dropped his limit to 45, and he was doing 20 over. Further along, they pulled into Blackwell's Corner, a lonely gas station at the edge of the highway in Kern County. Dean's last stop. He bought refreshments and ran into 2 fellow racers, Lance Reventlow and Bruce Kessler, heading to Salinas in Reventlo's Mercedes-Benz 300 SL. They stood together at that gas station, talking racing, and agreed to meet for dinner in Paso Robles later that evening. A dinner plan that fate would never allow. At approximately 5:15 p.m., Dean and Hickman left Blackwell's Corner and headed west on US 466. Dean accelerated the Spyder and pulled away from the station wagon, leaving Hickman far behind. He crested Polonio Pass and came down the long Antelope Grade, passing cars along the way. At approximately 5:45 in the evening, at the junction of US Route 466 and State Route 41, just outside a small town called Chalame, a two-tone black and white 1950 Ford Tudor was heading east. The driver was Donald Turnipseed, a 23-year-old Navy veteran and Cal Poly student heading home to Tulare for the weekend. He had a pregnant wife waiting for him at home. He began making a left turn onto Highway 41. He never saw the Porsche. The car was small and low to the ground, an unusual sight on American roads in 1955. The twilight hour made it almost invisible against the landscape. Dean saw what was coming. He tried a racing sidestepping maneuver to avoid the collision. But there was no time and no space. The two cars collided almost head-on. The impact sent the lightweight Spyder into a violent cartwheel. Witness John Robert White watched it happen. The car smashed into the ground 2 or 3 times, end over end, before landing in a gully beside the shoulder of the road. The force of the collision broad-slid Turnipseed's much heavier Ford 39 feet down the highway. When the Spyder finally came to rest, it had landed back on its wheels. James Dean was still strapped in his seat. Wutherick had been thrown clear of the wreck and was lying nearly unconscious on the shoulder of the road. Bystanders rushed over. A woman with nursing experience pressed her fingers to Dean's neck and found a faint pulse. About 10 minutes after the crash, Bill Hickman's station wagon arrived at the scene. Hickman got out and ran. He pried Dean from the mangled wreckage. Dean's left foot had been crushed between the clutch pedal and the brake pedal. And according to author Warren Beath, who wrote the definitive account of Dean's death, it was in Bill Hickman's arms that James Dean spent his final moments. The man who had given him the nickname. The man who had taught him to race. Holding him on the side of a California highway as the sun went down. Both Dean and Wuterich were loaded into the same ambulance and rushed 28 miles to Paso Robles War Memorial Hospital. James Dean was pronounced dead on arrival at 6:20 in the evening by attending physician Dr. Robert Bossert. The cause of death listed on his certificate: a broken neck, fractures of both arms, fractures of both jaws, and massive internal injuries. CHP Corporal Nelson estimated Dean's speed at around 55 miles per hour based on the wreckage, not the 85 to 90 miles per hour that would later be widely reported. Turnipseed was not seriously injured, a gashed forehead and a bloody nose. After being interviewed by the CHP at the scene, he hitchhiked home alone in the dark to Tulare. He was never charged. The coroner's jury later ruled accidental death with no criminal intent. Turnipseed never spoke publicly about the accident again. He granted one interview to his local newspaper immediately after the crash, and then closed the door on it forever. He went on to build a successful electrical contracting business in Tulare. He died in 1995 at the age of 63 from lung cancer. Hickman never forgot. He later said he did not sleep for 5 or 6 nights after that day. He carried those memories for the rest of his life. Wuterich survived the crash, but he never truly recovered either. Dean fans sent him abusive letters for years, blaming him for the actor's death. He carried the weight of that afternoon for the rest of his life. And 26 years later, on July 22, 1981, Rolf Wuterich lost control of his car in Kupferzell, Germany, crashing into the wall of a residence. Just like James Dean, he had to be cut from the wreck. And just like James Dean, he was pronounced dead at the scene. There is one more detail worth mentioning. Just weeks before the crash, Dean had filmed a road safety public service announcement. At the end of it, instead of reading the scripted closing line, he ad-libbed his own version. He looked into the camera and said, "The life you might save might be mine." The little bastard, meanwhile, had survived the collision completely. And what happened to that car next is the part of this story that people still cannot fully explain. The little bastard had survived the crash. Not intact, it was mangled, twisted, and destroyed beyond any hope of ever being driven again. But the shell was still there, still recognizable. The insurance company declared it a total loss, and it was sent to salvage, and later ended up in Burbank. And that is where the story of that car should have ended. It didn't. The first person to come looking for it was a Southern California racer named Dr. William Eschrich. He had competed against Dean that year on the racing circuit, and when word got out that the wreck of a Porsche 550 Spyder was sitting in a salvage yard in Burbank, one of only 90 ever built, with its engine still intact, Eschrich went looking for it. He found the wreck and bought the remains. Then he did something that would later become a central part of this story. He pulled out the engine. The same 4-cam Porsche engine that had been running on the afternoon James Dean died. He installed it into his own Lotus 9 race car. Other components from the wreck were passed along to a fellow racer and close friend, an orthopedic surgeon named Dr. Troy Lee McHenry. What was left of the shell, the frame, the crumpled body, the skeleton of the little bastard, eventually made its way to George Barris, the Hollywood car customizer known across the industry as the king of the customizers, the man who would later build the Batmobile. Barris originally planned to rebuild the car, but when he examined the frame properly, he found the damage was too severe. So instead, he stabilized the wreck with aluminum sheet metal and held on to it. When the shell arrived at his garage and was being unloaded from the transport, the car slipped off the trailer and fell directly onto one of the mechanics. Both of his legs were broken. Then came October 1956, 11 months after James Dean's death. Both Eschrich and McHenry entered the Pomona sports car races, Eschrich running Dean's engine in his Lotus, McHenry racing separately that same day. Eschrich was involved in a minor crash during the race. He walked away uninjured. McHenry was killed. His car left the track and struck a tree. He died at the scene. Now here is where we have to be honest with you about what is fact and what is legend. Some accounts later claimed that McHenry's car was still running parts from the little bastard when it crashed, but historians dispute that connection and say it cannot be confirmed. That claim may have been added to the story after the fact. However, 2 men tied to the little bastard's wreck were at the same racetrack that afternoon, but only one walked away. And that was enough. The whispers that had started in the racing community now spread outward into the wider world. The little bastard was cursed. That was the story. And once a story like that takes hold, it is almost impossible to stop. The car was still sitting in George Barris's garage, and Barris had plans for it. George Barris had a problem. He was sitting on the most famous wreck in America, and he couldn't rebuild it. The frame was too far gone. So instead of restoring the little bastard, he did something that tells you everything you need to know about George Barris. He made it look worse. He welded aluminum sheet metal over the damaged areas to stabilize the car, and then reportedly beat the panels with a 2x4 to make the wreck look as dramatic as possible. He was building an exhibit. In 1956, Barris loaned the little bastard to the Los Angeles chapter of the National Safety Council. It became part of a traveling road safety exhibition, a grim, grotesque, cautionary display aimed at young drivers. Show teenagers the car. Let them look at what speed had done. Make them think twice. From 1957 to 1959, the little bastard toured California. Car shows, movie theaters, bowling alleys, highway safety displays. Everywhere it went, crowds gathered to stand in front of the twisted wreck of the most famous car in Hollywood and stare. But the car, it seemed, was not finished causing trouble. During the touring years, the wreck was involved in a transporter accident in which a truck driver was reportedly killed. The details vary across sources and are not uniformly documented, but they have never been fully dismissed either. Then came March 11th, 1959. This one is not legend. The little bastard was being stored in a garage in Fresno, waiting to be displayed at an upcoming safety exhibit. That night, a fire broke out. This one is documented. A wire service story dated March 12, 1959, reported it directly, and the Fresno Bee confirmed it on May 12th. The damage was reported as slight. 2 tires burned. The paint was scorched. The cause of the fire was never determined. The little bastard had survived again. Later that same year, during a display at a Sacramento high school, the car reportedly slid off its display stand and struck a teenager who had been standing beside it examining the wreck. His hip was broken, and according to later accounts, the incidents continued. Another transporter fire in a separate city, the car reportedly surviving with little damage. And in Medford, Oregon, the little bastard supposedly broke free from its transport and collided with another vehicle on the road. Wherever that car went, something seemed to follow it. And then, in 1960, Barris arranged for the little bastard to be shipped to its next engagement, and according to the legend, it vanished in transit. The truck arrived at its destination. They opened it. The car was gone. In 1960, the little bastard was sent to Florida for a safety exhibition. When the show was over, Barris arranged for it to be shipped back. It never arrived. Now here is where it gets interesting, because Barris gave conflicting accounts of what happened, and he never quite told it the same way twice. In one version, the little bastard was loaded onto a sealed semi-trailer truck headed back to Los Angeles. The truck arrived. The seal was intact. They opened it. The car was gone. In another version, it was a sealed railway boxcar, loaded in Florida, bound for Los Angeles. The train arrived. Barris said he signed the manifest himself. He verified the seal was unbroken with his own hands. Then he opened the door. Empty. He looked the cameras in the eye and said, there was never any clue to its disappearance. Lee Raskin, the man who has studied this story more deeply than anyone alive, has a simple explanation for all of it. By 1960, the world had moved on. The teenagers who had grown up worshiping James Dean were now obsessed with American muscle cars, Detroit steel, big block engines. A crumpled little European sports car from 1955 wasn't drawing crowds anymore. Raskin believes Barris quietly retired the wreck and invented the disappearance to give the legend one final perfect ending, a vanishing act, the ultimate showman's finale. Barris filed a police report. Newspapers ran the story. Theories spread: stolen in Florida, stripped for parts, hidden to avoid a liability claim. One columnist came right out and said he thought Barris had staged the whole thing himself. Nothing was ever proven. Nothing was ever found. In 2005, on the 50th anniversary of Dean's death, the Volo Auto Museum offered $1 million to anyone who could prove they owned the genuine remains of the little bastard. Nobody came forward. The car has never surfaced, but parts of it are still out there. The engine, the same 4-cam Porsche unit that was running on the afternoon James Dean died, is still in the possession of the Eshrich family. And in 2021, an authenticated transaxle from the little bastard sold at auction for $387,000. The rest of it? Simply gone. Could still be in someone's hands right now. Could have been crushed decades ago. Nobody knows. So, was the little bastard cursed? Here is what we know for certain. A man warned Dean he would be dead within a week if he got into that car. Dean was dead within the week. Parts from the wreck ended up on a racetrack in Pomona, and one of the men connected to those parts was killed. The car survived fires, falls, and cross-country tours, and then vanished completely in 1960. Never found, never explained. And here is what we also know. George Barris was a showman who spent decades building and feeding the legend. He understood better than anyone that a good story, told often enough, becomes its own kind of truth. So maybe the little bastard was cursed, or maybe it was just a tragic machine that found itself in the hands of one of the greatest mythmaker in Hollywood. Maybe both things are true at the same time. Before we close this story, there is one more detail, and this one comes from a completely different part of the world. In Chinese numerology, the number 4 is considered the number of death, so feared that buildings skip the 4th floor entirely. Hospitals remove it from room numbers. The word for 4, in Chinese, sounds almost identical to the word for death. Some within that tradition go further. believing that any number whose digits add up to 4 carries the same dark meaning. Dean's racing number was 130. 1, 3, 0. Add those digits together, you get 4. Some say even that was a bad omen. Nobody chose that number with any dark intention. It was just a racing number painted on a hood, nothing more. But Dean never made it to the race. And somewhere in Paso Robles, Lance Reventlow and Bruce Kessler sat waiting at a dinner table for a friend who would never walk through the door.